Today we're going to talk about World War I on the home front, and particularly we're going to focus on women. So if you want to follow along, you can find the PowerPoint, or you can just go through it today with us in this discussion. So our goal for today is to explain the changing role of women during World War II. We know that prior to World War I, most women lived at home. Most women did not work outside the household, especially if you were a middle or upper class woman. On the other hand, during World War I, we know a lot of women took jobs in the factories while the men were away at war, and those women were quickly forced out of their jobs as soon as the war was over. It turns out that the men returning from war wanted their jobs back, and the government as well as private business was more than willing to oblige. So that brings us to World War II. Once again, we're going to call on women to work in the factories while men are away at war. So I guess the first thing that we need to do is look at our discussion question, our reflection question: should women be drafted? Explain why or why not. And you can go and answer this question on Google Classroom right now. There should be a question waiting for you in a separate category. We know that traditionally women had not been permitted to join the military, but some rules and some exceptions were made during World War II. We see the formation of what is known as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, the WAAC. Later, the auxiliary was dropped and it just became the Women's Army Corps, or the WAC, as you can see in the propaganda poster. And what the WAC was an organization formed for women to be part of the military. In May of 1942, over 350,000 women would serve in the military as part of the Women's Army Corps. Now, the Women's Army Corps were all non-combat positions. Women were not allowed to fight on the front lines, as even up until very recently, women were not allowed to fight on the front lines in combat in war. And definitely not during World War II. So what most women at the time would have been doing were some of the jobs that they would have done during the Civil War or even World War I. Things like nurses. A lot of women became nurses. A lot of women were ambulance drivers. A lot of women in the Women's Army Corps worked in positions providing health care for injured workers. Some other non-combat positions available to women: radio operators, so you needed women to work as radio switchers back then. We also needed women to serve as electricians aboard ships, tanks, planes, you name it, we needed women to work on it. And we also had many women serving as pilots. Again, women are serving as non-combat pilots. They're mostly delivery pilots, cargo planes essentially, but women do play a role as pilots during the war. Now, when we talk about women at home, we're really talking about women on the home front, or more likely, women in the workplace. So once again, we see women going back to war. Not back to war, back to work. We see a lot of women going back to work. In fact, over 5 million women would take jobs during World War II. Of course, one of the downsides of women taking jobs is, like we talked about during World War I, pretty much women were always being supervised by men. There were always men looking over their shoulders. Women were never truly given the jobs and the positions requiring high levels of skill. Women were doing the grunt jobs, while the men would work as the supervisors. So still, we see a lot of sexism in the world, even into World War II. So of course, we see most women, even when they get a job, not only are they not management, but they're probably not making nearly as much money as men do. The average woman during the beginning of World War II was making a little over $7,000 a year. Men were making almost twice that at a little over $14,000 a year. And we can see that as displayed in the chart. 40% less. Now, a lot of the jobs that women took were the non-traditional jobs, jobs that women had never done before, or maybe jobs that women had done during World War I. And once again, women were proving that they could do jobs the same as men. They could do many of the jobs that men were doing at the time. So women became welders. A lot of the ships were built by women who were welding. A lot of aircraft built by women who were welding. Of course, construction jobs, whether it be the construction of a barracks or some other type of work site or a factory. And many women will serve as truck drivers, traditionally seen as a male's job, and probably the most famous, as portrayed by Rosie the Riveter, the job of women as a machinist, working on high-powered lathes and other machines within the factories during World War II. Many women would also work on planes and building planes, building ships, building guns and ammunition, and of course working on tanks, as you see in the picture. And women were working as just the same types of jobs that men would have. And this is a significant change from the world that we see before. Women had never done these jobs before, and once women get the right to do the job, they prove that they can do it very well. Probably the most famous woman from the war is a woman known as Rosie the Riveter. It's a nickname really for all the women who work in the factories. And so I have a YouTube video of where the name Rosie the Riveter came from and a fancy jingle from the 1940s. The end was not added by me, but I think in many ways shows the discrimination that women still face in society today. So one of the things that we see with Rosie the Riveter, as pointed out, women often did the job much better than men, or at least as well as men, and that was one of the traits of the hardworking women who helped us win World War II. Of course, you see the very sexist comment at the end, it's back to work, it's back to the kitchen for many women, and unfortunately many women did lose their jobs after World War II. Same thing as after World War I, many of the women were required to give up their jobs for the men returning from war. That said, women had a new sense of independence, and we'll see that play out in the 1950s, but more on that later. I ask you this question, and again, if we were in class, we'd have a discussion on it, but we're not. So the simple question, do both of your parents work outside the home? And my guess is for most of you today, the answer would be yes. However, if we were to look back in the 1940s, that would have been very unusual. Most parents, the husband would work and the wife would simply stay at home, which doesn't mean she wasn't working. Keeping up a house is probably as much of a job or more of a job than actually going off to work. But certainly most women were not working outside of the home before World War II, and although more are after World War II, still a lot of women stay in the home until the 1950s. So once again, we mentioned it before, women are forced to give up their jobs after World War II is over. When it comes to seniority, the men who had the jobs before World War II broke out were given their jobs back after World War II was over. Now in class, we'll probably watch a video called Rosie the Riveter. We'll find out a little bit more about Rosie, and well, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed learning about the role of women during World War II. And tomorrow in class, we'll pick up with the role of many minorities during World War II. So the life of many minorities, particularly African Americans, changed significantly during World War II. We'll cover that in tomorrow's class. Have a great evening.